I am speaking as an imposter in many ways because I'm speaking of the imaging community in a country from which I did not hail. I've been in Korea for 3 years, 4 years almost, at a time when the pandemic has happened, etc., working in the Institut Pasteur Korea. And this has given me an insight on what is happening here in Korea specifically, but also from a point of view representing the Institut Pasteur of the international network of the Institut Pasteur around the world, of which our partner in Montevideo is present during this meeting as well. And it would be interesting to speak at some point to discuss the relevance of these sorts of connections between pre-existing and experienced networks in biomedicine that have existed in the case of Pasteur since 130 years. But today what I'm going to speak of very rapidly now is to talk about the Republic of Korea and the imaging that happens in the rock, in the peninsula. Whoops. Did the slide advance? Do you see the screen okay? Whoops. Are you seeing a slide? Yep, you go. Okay, very good.
All good.
So I'm just going to rapidly summarize in terms of the community organization. As many of you may already be aware, the investment in research in Korea is enormous. There are massive amounts of budget being made available from several different ministries within the government, including the ministry for which we're most connected, the so-called MSIT, the Ministry of Science and Information Technology. The budgetary investment is actually, last time I looked, the highest in the world relative to GDP. That includes Israel, that includes the United States, etc. So it's a massive investment. And I'm going to sort of wave my hands at that point again in a few moments. It's clear that imaging is actually a very central part of government policy making with regards to giving financing. And I will again wave my hands at that point in a few moments. But it's interesting that when you put that much money in front of scientists, there is a lot to account for. And a part of that accounting involves a little bit the bean counting, the KPIs of performance that need to be presented in order to jump the bars of evaluation. Like any bureaucratic structure that is talking about large amounts of money, this is measured in publications, it's measured in patents, it's measured in out-licensing, because the culture in Korea at a level of scientific and technology drive is very much focused in conversion to the notion of enterprise and out-licensing. So behind that, there's the bureaucratic side, the government side, which is, as I said, like any space, you have a lot of money available. Of course, administration and management is necessary, but it creates a bureaucratic culture that in itself can be quite antithetical to scientific communication, because it creates concurrence between competing partners in the university system, in private system, in government system, and it creates silos as well, which I think has been mentioned by several of the speakers during this interesting discussion today. And finally, a point that I'm especially sensitive to, of course, is that I see and feel that international scientific culture here, there are many challenges to overcome in order to have a dialogue, a discourse that is constructive at the level of sharing. And of course, sharing data, open science, these are notions that we see as being important. I'm going to sort of finish on that point. But at the same time, they can also be concurrent to enterprise culture, which is a part of the driving force, as I said, for the funding that happens here. So I'm going to wave my hands at this slide. This is literally just things I just picked off the internet from partner sites that I know. There are both government level, I mean, literally towns that are organized with technologies, facilities, everything you could possibly imagine in environments like the case in Daejeon. The Institute of Biological Sciences of Basic Science rather is an enormous basic science-driven investment vehicle for attracting and maintaining a very high-level science activity. Many of those sites have a lot of very high-powered imaging going on, and you would have seen work coming from IBS in high-level journals during the last few years, speaking to deep learning and applications in imaging, for example. Massive interest in the hospital system. So there are research hospitals, there is the Asan hospital network, and of course imaging is at the heart of the whole clinical drive. The clinical drive is seen as, again, critically important because it is conversion to a benefit to public health, and of course an economy that's driven by a focus on biomedical health in the future. So not to dwell on this too long, to show you a montage of, there's some fantastic imaging happening in Korea. There is no question of this. This is two snapshots. One on the left is NST, the National Research Council of Science and Technology, and the one on the right is the NRIF, which is effectively the science funding agency in Korea. Both are aligned with at least one of the ministries, the Ministry of Science and Technology in Korea, and have been influenced by the policy making of various governments as they come through and use the vehicle of the ministry to deploy financing. And this financing reflects, as you see from these dots on this map on the left, these are sites that are not imaging structures. These are technology centers that are doing research for biomedicine and physics and manufacturing and fabrication and informatics as well. So this is a larger picture. What you see is that it's not just in Seoul, that the financing and the drive of the if you like, the civil service enterprise institutes is very much distributed across the whole of the peninsula, which is very much a conscious policy-driven decision over many decades to assure that investment in science and technology, including imaging and biomedicine, will be distributed really across the whole of the peninsula. And this is a very good thing. Going a little further, this actually spreads into the presence of these very same government level technology institutions. Globally, they are present in China, the US, Vietnam, Germany, India, Costa Rica. So you can see that there's actually a conscious effort by the Korean government where it comes to technology investment, including imaging, that it should be distributed both across the peninsula domestically, but also internationally, and there is outreach at this level. This is in part because there's over $6 billion a year being spent on this very same science, and that is distributed across the university system, the private research system, which is where the Institut Pasteur is, and is not competitive with the NST structures. So the reason I show this is to say that there is a high level of organization in Korea. And this last slide, speaking to this point, is a snapshot from a tool called Zeus. Zeus is actually a Korean portal available to and necessary, is obligatory to be used by all organizations that receive any of that funding from the NRF or if they're part of the NST structures. So almost all of the organizations that have any value in the ecosystem of science and technology in Korea are registered to Zeus, and they have to put their equipment in here. They have to say when they bought it. All of the metadata is connected to this. Everything is linked in a way that there is an expression of a management of of a national level core facility management. If you see on the bottom right-hand side here, there's a notion of the causal relationship, the motivation. There's a little prayer of motivation here on the right-hand side of the slide at the bottom, which I've translated, and it mentions the three axes of failure, which are budget wasted, productivity is down, and exchange and cooperation between researchers is poor. So bring it on. There is a core facility culture here in Korea. Now, all of these things are very inspiring. However, if you look at the summary of what I've told you, effectively I've said there's lots of funding. There is policy-driven effort at the level of government, at the highest level, going down. Imaging is all organized into facilities that are available, obligatory available as services. And there are community domestic level actions that are intended to support the benefit for public health. So that's pretty much the whole thing in a nutshell. However, on the red text at the bottom of this slide, actually some of the paradoxical result of that is that there are not structures that I can point to in Korea and say, they're like France Bioimaging or like UKRI, or is there something equivalent to a federative drive regionally to have like ELMI or Euro Bioimaging? And so the notion of GBI or Africa Bioimaging, somehow this hasn't boiled into that yet, but I feel that it's awaiting us. It's sort of just around the corner. So just a couple of slides more to finish up. Speaking to this point of the benefit of imaging for public health. Evidently, the pandemic precipitated that. The response of Korea was very robust, and so levels of infection have been quite low in Korea. So it was actually a notion of continuing to work. In fact, because of what we do in the IPK, there was a lot of services being rendered through the Institute, and there's been a massive increase in the amount of both commercial company and academic requirements for BSL-3, S3 and A3 facilities for doing in vivo and in cellular work for high content screening and for PK studies. This has triggered actually more investment into imaging, so it definitely looks good. It's sort of catalyzing us to go in the right direction. But there's nothing specifically focused yet to imaging. And on that point, I think that there's a sense that in part, there won't be a thematic, there won't be investment in a thematic that just says imaging. It has to be investment in a thematic that says imaging because we're solving a problem. And that problem needs to be a public health problem, a biology problem, something that is necessarily seen as having its value outside of the technology that gets you there. And that sort of speaks to Ricardo's point earlier on. Sometimes you have to justify why you have the technology curiosity. So this last slide speaks to the opportunities that are directly ahead. This is my personal opinion. I'm not representing the opinions of the community of Korea. This is much more from my personal observations. I think there's great opportunities for bioimaging informatics. And that's something that there's great competence in Korea, yet there is not so much deep learning driven imaging expertise. Deep learning expertise tends to be in other areas, just so you know. Image data management and sharing. This is a major issue, not because there's not the equipment to share the data, but much rather because of that siloing effect, the concurrence. Nobody wants to share their data. And so to actually give a reason why you share the data is sort of half the battle. And then finally, this notion of coordination of federated bioimaging. I think that there's sort of a tipping point, there's a fulcrum. I think that Korea is sort of ready to do this. That tool is, you're forced to use Zeus, the tool I showed you earlier on, because it's obligatorily made necessary by the government. Singapore, Graham Wright, they have something similar there, sort of government level drive to centralize things and follow how equipment is being used. Korea could be there for sure. And I think for capacity building, bioimaging infrastructure, and for hardware resource sharing, this is all going to be policy driven in the future in the next few years. So there's great opportunities in Korea. That's my general take on things here. With that, I would say thank you for listening.